UFO researchers have long suspected that a government cover-up has prevented the public from knowing the full story about visitors from other planets. In 1973, for instance, the director of the FBI denied that his agency had ever investigated UFOs.
In 1976, the agency released more than 1,100 pages of UFO information that it had collected over many years. What forced the disclosure? It was the Freedom of Information Act. Tonight, in part 3 of our series, UFOs, the Best Evidence, George Knapp reports on other secrets that have been pried out of the government.
UFO skeptics often ask, if there are aliens visiting Earth, why don't they announce themselves by flying over the White House? The answer is, UFOs did fly over the White House twice. It happened in July 1952. As the New York Times reported, 7 eerie glowing objects were spotted by pilots in the air and people on the ground. 12 different radar operators tracked the UFOs at speeds of up to 7,000 miles per hour. A week later, the objects were back again. When jets were scrambled, the lights either disappeared or zoomed away. The Air Force explained that what everyone had seen was a temperature inversion. To a man, the radar operators disagreed, but the official explanation is the one that stuck. Government explanations of UFOs are often just plain wrong. In 1965, thousands of people from Canada to Mexico watched a formation of UFOs maneuver in the skies. The Air Force said it was the constellation Orion, even though at the time Orion could only be seen from the other side of the planet. A UFO landing at White Sands Missile Base was said to be a sighting of the planet Venus, to which one UFO buff responded, "It was unforgettable the night Venus landed on the gypsum flats of New Mexico." The standing joke in UFO circles is that for every 200 UFO sightings, the Air Force can explain away 201. The possibility that our government might withhold or distort information about UFOs might seem far-fetched until you read the mountains of evidence compiled from the government's own files, evidence that strongly suggests a cover-up. The U.S. military first started seeing UFOs in World War II. Pilots called them Foo Fighters. We thought they were a German secret weapon. The Germans thought they were ours. An explosion of civilian sightings in 1947 caught the military by surprise. Secret investigations were begun. A joint study by the FBI and Army concluded the flying saucer situation is not all imaginary. Something is really flying around. That report was kept secret until 1976.
Yes, there was a degree of secrecy. In certain cases, there might be sightings on radar, and we didn't want the Russians to know we had a radar here or a radar there.
Class is correct, but only to a point, because most of the early UFO sightings were by eyewitnesses, not radar. In New Mexico, for instance, over a 2-year period, dozens of people reported seeing green fireballs over sensitive military installations. But when radar and cameras were dispatched to those installations, the fireballs mysteriously shifted someplace else. A 1949 study by scientists at Los Alamos Lab stated the fireballs deserve serious consideration.
Come on, we gotta get him. Wait, let him go. They'll never believe me. You fools, you're in danger! Can't you see? They're after you! They're after all of us! They're here already!
Some have suggested the saucer craze of the 40s and 50s was a byproduct of Cold War tensions and fears. Both the U.S. and the USSR conducted secret studies to find out if the other side was behind the UFOs, and both concluded early on that the capabilities of the flying discs seemed beyond human technology. This secret report, done in 1948 by the Air Force and Naval Intelligence, is among the most fascinating UFO documents ever to surface, because it wasn't supposed to exist. A confidential memo at the end of the report ordered that all copies should be destroyed, but one copy survived and was finally pried out of the Pentagon in 1985. It's a study of more than 200 of the earliest UFO sightings, including one that occurred in June 1947 near Lake Mead. An Air Force pilot saw a formation of 6 UFOs. The report notes the UFOs are some type of flying craft, not weather balloons or hallucinations, that sighting reports were made by experienced personnel, and that the origin of flying saucers is not ascertainable. The overall effort to study saucers was called Project Sign, with headquarters at Wright Field in Ohio. In 1949, Sign personnel wrote a top-secret report concluding UFOs were extraterrestrial craft. When the report made it to the desk of Chief of Staff General Hoyt Vandenberg, though, he rejected it and ordered all copies burned. This rejection from the top was, in the view of many, the death knell for objective study of UFOs. A few weeks later, Project Sign produced another final report saying its findings were inconclusive. That report was accepted, and soon after, Project Sign became Project Grudge. Grudge evaluated reports on the premise that UFOs could not exist. According to a later report by the Library of Congress, it was the job of Grudge to explain them all. Despite this slant, 23% of Grudge cases remained a mystery. Grudge staffers decided these cases were psychologically motivated, the first official declaration that people who see UFOs are crazy.
The government established an intensive program of ridicule against anyone who said they saw flying saucers, and fear of ridicule was the foundation on which the cover-up was placed. Nobody likes to be ridiculed.
The sightings continued nonetheless. In 1952, there were more sightings than the 5 previous years combined, including the Washington, D.C. incidents. Yet another study was launched, Project Blue Book. Blue Book today is notorious in UFO circles as a whitewash. There is considerable evidence the project was far from objective. The man appointed to head Blue Book, Captain Edward Rappelt, says he was told in the very beginning that the powers that be are anti-flying saucer. To stay in favor, it behooves one to follow suit. Rappelt later resigned from the military and wrote a book about what he says was the Blue Book cover-up and the reality of flying saucers. The continued increase in UFO sightings was a source of concern to the CIA, and a new strategy was born, debunking. A group of CIA-connected scientists was assembled in secret to evaluate UFOs. The so-called Robertson panel spent all of 12 hours in a roundtable discussion about a handful of UFO cases. The panel concluded that UFOs are not a threat to national security, but that continued reporting of UFOs is a threat. The recommendation? The government should take immediate steps to strip UFOs of their aura of mystery through a program of public education. The final report even used the term debunking. The debunking included spying on UFO witnesses and the infiltration of UFO organizations by the CIA and FBI. The Air Force tried to insinuate that saucers were earthly inventions by leaking information about an unwieldy craft called the Avro Disc.
A 2-seater, ready soon, may be the car or chopper of the future. Help wanted, a crew of little green men.
The strategy included the silencing of military personnel through intimidation. Bill Cooper served in both the Air Force and the Navy and says he and 3 other sailors witnessed a UFO off the coast of Hawaii.
When we arrived back in port, we were debriefed by Office of Naval Intelligence officer who basically the gist of the debriefing was is you didn't see anything and you're not going to talk about anything, and if you do, you're going to be in deep trouble.
A similar order was issued to hundreds of airmen at a base in Alaska who watched 2 UFOs play cat and mouse with Air Force jets. One witness, who asked to remain anonymous, recalls the order that was issued.
A gag order, in essence, that what you thought you saw and heard on the previous day to this directive, you did not see and you did not hear. And it did not happen.
Even retired military personnel have felt the squeeze.
If you were of my vintage and you were retired from the military and someone said you open your mouth and that's the end of your retirement pay, you think not only once, you think quite a few times.
For 3 decades, the military has publicly scoffed at UFOs, but it's been another matter behind the scenes. A secret order issued to Air Force base commanders in 1960 stated UFOs should be treated as, quote, serious business, directly related to national security. Public pressure spurred Congress to hold hearings about UFOs in the mid-60s, and the Air Force decided enough is enough. It commissioned what was to be the ultimate UFO study, conducted by Edward Condon of the University of Colorado. Condon was a respected scientist, but was hardly impartial about UFOs. Before the study even began, he said in a speech that the government should get out of the UFO business. There's nothing to it. He later wrote the authors of UFO books should be horsewhipped. There is even evidence that the study's conclusions were were written before the project even began. To the surprise of few, the committee declared that further study of UFOs would be a waste of time. The Air Force used this as its reason to finally end Project Blue Book.
None of the evidence that I have examined would indicate any proof at all that we are being visited by extraterrestrials.
We have not been hiding anything. The investigations have been made public.
Call up an Air Force base today to report a UFO and you'll be told the military no longer collects such information. It all ended with Blue Book. Government documents contradict these statements. A 1969 order by Air Force General C.H. Bolander reveals that UFO reports which could affect national security are not part of the Blue Book system and should continue to be handled through standard Air Force procedure. UFO researchers have long suspected that Blue Book was merely for public consumption, that another secret UFO program existed to handle the most sensitive cases. The Bolander memo may verify these suspicions. There are other indications that the policy continues. Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque has been the site of numerous UFO incidents, including 4 separate incidents in August 1980. Security police reported UFO landings in and around nuclear weapons storage areas. Base radar equipment was knocked out during the landings. A secret Air Force report about the incident states the Air Force is no longer publicly active in UFO research, but still has an interest in all UFO sightings over Air Force installations. The document also reveals that several other government agencies actively investigate legitimate sightings through covert cover. Does this mean CIA? The CIA responds to UFO requests in this fashion. There is no CIA program to actively collect information on UFOs, nor has there been one since the 1950s. This statement flies in the face of numerous reports squeezed out of the agency by Freedom of Information lawsuits. A series of internal memos dated 1976 make repeated references to UFO research, UFO studies, CIA UFO experts, and agency personnel who are monitoring the UFO phenomenon. The reluctance to admit an interest in UFOs dates back at least to 1952. An internal letter from CIA's weapons chief states it is strongly urged that no indication of CIA interest reach the press or public in light of their alarmist tendencies. Officially, CIA and other government agencies say their lack of interest is because UFOs pose no threat to national security. Yet UFOs have made alarming intrusions at our most sensitive military bases. As the Washington Post reported, UFOs visited 5 separate nuclear missile launch sites near the Canadian border during a 2-week period in 1975, one right after the other. In at least one case, the UFOs tampered with the launch codes of ICBM missiles. Fighter planes were unable to catch the UFOs, which makes the government explanation that these were mystery helicopters seem specious. Mystery helicopters that can outrace F-16s visiting nuclear missile bases? If this isn't national security, what is? Oddly, the government has used the national security excuse to withhold UFO data. Stan Friedman and others fought all the way to the Supreme Court to get UFO documents from the National Security Agency. All they got was a summary of the documents.
Here it is, legal affidavit, NSA, and so forth. The trouble is, as you start to go through this document, you rather quickly find that a lot of it isn't really there. And I won't stop because you'll see how many pages are really full of good information. To make a long story short, approximately 75% of this document isn't there.
It's the biggest secret in the history of mankind, and the government is not going to let this out.
Who's not going to let it out? Is there a secret government within the government? And what, if anything, do UFOs have to do with the mutilation of cattle in Nevada and elsewhere? More on these topics tomorrow. George Knapp, Eyewitness News 8.
Tomorrow night, George continues a look at the UFOs and the debate about their existence.
Part 4 focuses on numerous encounters between UFOs and American astronauts.
One of the most persistent stories surrounding the UFO phenomenon is that UFOs have made a practice of following American space missions. Several astronauts have been quoted about the deep space encounters, but there has been no official confirmation of such contact. Tonight, in Part 4 of UFOs, The Best Evidence, George Knapp looks at NASA policies regarding ETs. He'll also find out if there is a connection between UFOs and the mutilation of thousands of animals. We should warn you that some of the photos you're about to see are graphic.
In March 1989, the crew of the Space Shuttle Discovery may have discovered something unexpected. A ham radio operator claims to have picked up the voice of Discovery pilot Colonel John Blaha speaking on a secret NASA channel.
Houston, this is Discovery. We still have the alien spacecraft under observance.
Is this really the voice of Blaha claiming to have an alien spacecraft under observance? Listen to the recording again, then listen to Blaha during a later transmission.
Houston, this is Discovery. We still have the alien spacecraft under observance. It's a shame we can't be here all the time with a permanent manned space station. We ought to get in that direction.
NASA says it is not the voice of Blaha. However, UFOs have reportedly dogged the U.S. space program since the very beginning. UFO researchers claim that NASA's own logs show that virtually all of the early Gemini and Apollo missions encountered UFOs. NASA has explained most of these sightings as space debris or solar flares, but some of its own astronauts have disagreed. UFO sightings have been reported by James Lovell, James McDivitt, Wally Schirra, Deke Slayton, Gordon Cooper, and others. Cooper went so far as to write a letter in 1978 to a United Nations panel on UFOs, saying that he and others had seen UFOs, but that astronauts are very reluctant to discuss the topic. He also stated these are extraterrestrial vehicles visiting this planet from other planets. Cooper has since recanted his statements, but won't say why. Attempts were made to contact Cooper and the other astronauts, but no responses were received. NASA's official policy states that it is not engaged in any UFO research, nor is any other government agency. Still, it's interesting to note that NASA has, since 1977, been the government's only official mouthpiece for UFO information. It's also true that NASA has extensive written policies governing encounters with extraterrestrial life forms, and agency documents contain suggested procedures that should be followed in the event that contact is made with an ET civilization. UFO researchers believe these policies were created because the government knows a lot more about alien life forms than it's telling us. If there is a cover-up, who is calling the shots? Many people believe that there's a secret government within the government, something called MJ-12 or Magic 12 or Majestic. This document is easily the most controversial in UFO circles. It is supposedly a briefing document prepared in 1952 for President-elect Dwight Eisenhower, explaining that a secret group of scientists and military men had been created by President Truman to study the UFO situation and to keep a lid on it. The chief scientist in MJ-12 was said to have been presidential science advisor Dr. Vannevar Bush.
If it's a legitimate document, it establishes, one, that a flying saucer crashed, two, that the wreckage was recovered, 1947, three, that the government has successfully kept that secret since that time, four, that a very high-level group, including, as it happens, the first four directors of Central Intelligence, first Secretary of Defense, etc., was set up, established to deal with that.
Friedman was given a $16,000 grant by a UFO group to research the legitimacy of the MJ-12 document. He has since found other government memos that refer to MJ-12, as well as additional supporting material. However, arguments about the legitimacy of the briefing document have raged in UFO circles for years. Arguments about such minutiae as typewriter brands, date placements, and phraseology.
I've tried to deal with every argument, and there are dozens that have been made by the noisy negativists. All kinds of format and style, and they wouldn't have done this, that, or the other thing. I've found that none of those arguments stand up.
However, Philip Klass and others have cast so many aspersions on the MJ-12 document that even die-hard UFO buffs now doubt its legitimacy. But they don't automatically reject everything in it. Whoever forged it, if it's a forgery, may have included enough real information to confuse things, and perhaps to lead researchers on a wild alien chase. There is independent confirmation of some of the MJ-12 details from highly reliable sources. Wilbert Smith, a respected scientist for the Canadian government in the 1950s, wrote this top-secret memo to his superiors, describing his talks with American scientists. Said Smith, in the U.S., the matter is classified higher than the H-bomb. Flying saucers do exist, and they're being studied by a small group headed by Vannevar Bush. This memo was enough to convince the Canadian government to establish its own UFO study program just 2 weeks later. Another source of confirmation is Dr. Robert Sarbacher, president of the Washington Institute of Technology, a key member of the Manhattan Project, and a scientist of impeccable credentials. In this 1983 letter, Sarbacher admitted matter-of-factly that Vannevar Bush was involved with secret UFO research, that crashed disks and alien bodies had been recovered, and that UFOs were highly classified. Even UFO skeptics have had difficulty giving Sarbacher the brush off. If there is or was an MJ-12, it may have had good reasons for keeping UFOs a secret. Perhaps most compelling is that humans can't presume to know why aliens are here, if they are here. The behavior ascribed to ETs by various witnesses is so foreign to us as to seem unfathomable. One of the weirdest activities attributed to aliens is the bizarre mutilation of animals. Scattered stories of carved-up livestock and strange lights in the sky date back to the 1890s in the U.S., but it wasn't until the early 1970s that a pattern began to emerge. A mutilation explosion rocked Midwestern, then Western states. Then, as now, the main targets were cows, although horses, deer, pigs, goats, and other animals have received similar treatment. Today, nearly 15,000 mutilation reports have been received. Most often, the phantom surgeons remove sex organs, udders, rectums, eyes, or ears. The carcasses are usually drained of blood, but blood is rarely found on the ground. There are occasional burn marks on or around the dead beasts, and the cutting is performed with scalpel-like precision.
It's hard to visualize or even comprehend why someone would drive up and kill an animal and then take the male parts out. I don't know. It's beyond me to, it's beyond me to understand it.
Former State Senator Floyd Lamb has lost 2 prize bulls to the mystery mutilations. Like many ranchers, he's self-reliant and didn't bother to file police reports. His Lincoln County ranch sits adjacent to the Nevada test site, so he's seen his share of odd things over the years, but he hasn't got a clue about who is carving up cattle.
I don't know I don't understand that. Some kook.
Lamb has several neighbors who've also lost cattle. Most of those weren't reported either. In all of Lincoln County, we could find only 6 official mutilation reports dating back to 1975. But many people we talked to had heard of others.
Oh, yes, there was several. I hesitate to give a figure, but several.
This is Jane Bradshaw's ranch. She's filed 2 reports of mutilated cows in 8 years. One of the mutilations occurred just yards away from her house. No one heard or saw anything, and as is normal, there were no tracks found. Still, Bradshaw and her children surmised that devil worshippers with poison dart guns were responsible.
You don't just walk up to a big, healthy animal like this and tell it to lay down. You know, you've got to do something to it. And it wasn't shot. It wasn't stabbed. I mean, it wasn't killed in any way. So it'd have to have been some kind of a dart or sleeping thing to make it fall.
Roving bands of shadowy Satan worshippers are frequently mentioned as possible culprits in the mutilations. Some researchers insist there just aren't enough devil worshippers out there, especially in rural areas, to commit such widespread mayhem. Former Lincoln County Sheriff Larry Wilkinson personally investigated 3 mutilation cases. He dismisses the notion of knife-wielding Beelzebubs because of the sophistication involved.
The cuts that were made up the legs and the inside of the legs and up the belly. Looked like you could have taken a zipper and zipped the cow right back together again. They were 1/8 serrated cuts were made on the cow. We cut down into the animal and found out that the ball joint was gone, completely gone, off just that one shoulder, and just a perfectly flat cut inside. No bone chips, nothing that you would get from a meat saw where you're leaving pieces of bone part or anything like that. It was cut, I don't know how.
Some government researchers have blamed predators for some mutilations, but the likelihood of a mountain lion making an incision like a cookie cutter seems remote, and coyotes have never fared well against living, breathing cows. The Bradshaw family insists that neither predators nor any other animal was responsible because not even maggots would come near the carcasses.
Several weeks later, I think the coyotes finally did touch the animal's head, try eating on its head, but they wouldn't touch the body, which is odd because they're scavengers and they'll eat anything.
Documentary filmmaker Linda Howe refers to the mutilations as an alien harvest. Howe has followed up on hundreds of cases and says whatever cut open these cattle didn't use a knife or pinking shears. Pathologists have told Howe that the cuts went between rather than through the animal's microscopic cells. A laser capable of doing such work would approximate the size of an office desk. hard to cart out into an open pasture. Hal's investigations have found an unusually high correlation between mutilations and UFO sightings. In some cases, the strange lights in the sky are soon followed by mystery helicopters, leading some to speculate that the UFO mutilators are being monitored themselves by someone with a lot of helicopters. The lack of blood or tracks, the sophistication of the cuts, occasional tripod-like indentations found near the bodies. To Hal and others, this all adds up to UFOs.
I've never counted UFOs out, and I still don't to this day.
I've seen some weird things over this mountain at night. That's towards the test site.
What do they do?
Well, I just remember some kind of a bright light going up and coming down.
Whitley Strieber, who's written 2 best-selling books about alien abductions of humans, doesn't think the mutilations of cows are so weird.
It could be that if they are visitors from another planet, they use the cattle for the same reason we do. And it's true that the things that are done to the cattle are quite horrible, but if you think the visitors are the only ones doing horrible things to the cattle, I recommend that you visit a slaughterhouse.
But is it food or some other use the UFOs have for cows? Scientists have only recently discovered a remarkable similarity between the chromosomes of cattle and of people. The possibility of some genetic experiment associated with this strange harvest is enough to make one shudder. The proximity of the Lincoln County incidents to the Nevada test site and the ultra-secret Area 51 is also of interest to some. There's a long-standing suspicion that Area 51 is an alien haven, a place where UFOs drift through the night sky. The stories recently prompted radio host Billy Goodman to organize a field trip to the outskirts of 51. Nearly 100 people unfolded their lawn chairs, unfurled their American flags, and sat back to await E.T.
What we need is a real strong, positive attitude. When you get yourself in position, zero in on your area and try to make something come your way.
They don't get clouds in the summertime out here. They don't get much rain out here. This is a classic mothership appearance.
But those expecting a mothership were somewhat disappointed. On this night, there were several false sightings, car lights, stars, and other explainable objects. And it all took place under the watchful eye of Lincoln County deputies.
Well, I came up here to try and see if I could see some UFOs, basically.
But I've driven further on for a lot crazier things.
Straight up!
Straight up!
It's moving. Look how fast it's going. I knew. My ears rang when it came over.
Despite the ringing ears, no flying saucers were seen while our camera was present, but the faithful say they saw unexplainable lights later that night. These days, Area 51, adjacent to Groom Lake, has become a nightly desert hangout for UFO believers. Is it a modern folk legend, or is something really going on here? Tomorrow, a scientist who says he worked on flying saucers. George Knapp, Eyewitness News 8.
I guess we'll get more on that tomorrow.